The fuel gauge needle hovered dangerously close to empty, its red warning light blinking like a dying heartbeat in the darkness. Cade squinted through the rain-streaked visor of his helmet, calculating miles against gallons, time against distance, hope against reality. 43 miles to the hospital. Maybe 2 gallons left in the tank. The Harley got decent mileage when he wasn't pushing it through a hurricane, but tonight every twist of the throttle was a gamble. His phone buzzed again against his ribs, vibrating through the leather of his vest like an angry wasp. Dr. Martinez, probably. Or maybe the night nurse with another update he didn't want to hear. Bree's fever climbing. The new medication not taking hold. Blood work showing numbers that made seasoned doctors speak in careful, measured tones. Lightning carved the sky into jagged pieces, illuminating the storm clouds that stretched from horizon to horizon like a bruised ceiling pressing down on the earth. The rain came in waves, sometimes gentle enough to see through, sometimes hammering the asphalt so hard it bounced back up in silver needles. Cade leaned forward, tucking himself closer to the bike's frame, feeling the water find every gap in his gear and soak through to his skin. He'd left the construction site 3 hours late because Martinez needed the foundation poured before the storm hit. 3 hours that might as well have been 3 years, given how fast things could change when your 7-year-old daughter was fighting an infection that had already put 2 other kids in intensive care. The overtime pay would cover another week of medications, but money didn't matter if he wasn't there when Bree needed him most. The speedometer climbed past 85 as Cade pushed through a straightaway, the yellow lines disappearing beneath his front wheel like a zipper being pulled shut. His fuel light blinked faster now, urgent and accusatory. He did the math again. 38 miles. Maybe 1.5 gallons. If he kept the RPMs low on the hills, coasted when he could, maybe, just maybe, he'd make it. That's when the storm decided to remind him who was really in control. The wind hit like a fist, nearly shoving him into the guardrail before he could compensate. Rain turned to hail for 30 seconds, marble-sized chunks of ice bouncing off his helmet and shoulders. Then back to rain, but harder now, sheeting across the highway in curtains so thick his headlight barely penetrated 10 feet ahead. The overpass appeared through the gloom like the ribs of some massive beast, concrete pillars rising into the darkness. Cade had crossed this bridge 1,000 times, knew every crack and curve, but tonight it looked alien, transformed by the storm into something menacing and unfamiliar. Traffic moved in cautious single file, hazard lights blinking like nervous eyes. That's when he saw her. At first she was just movement in his peripheral vision, a pale shape that didn't belong among the concrete and steel. Then his headlights swept across her as he took the curve onto the bridge, and time seemed to stutter. A young woman stood at the walkway's edge, motionless as a statue while 60-mile-per-hour traffic screamed past just yards away. Her white dress, or what had once been white, clung to her frame like wet tissue paper, torn and stained with mud and something darker. Cars swept around her without slowing. A pickup truck's horn blared as it passed, but the driver never touched his brakes. A family sedan, a delivery van, another motorcycle. All of them flowing past the girl like water around a stone, as if she were invisible, as if she didn't exist. But Cade saw her face in that brief moment when his light found her, and what he saw there made his chest tighten like a vice. She wasn't just standing on the bridge. She was holding onto the railing with both hands, swaying slightly, her long brown hair whipping across features that were too young, too afraid, too broken to be standing alone in a storm that was tearing the night apart. His rational mind cataloged the facts with military precision. 36 miles to the hospital. Fuel critically low. Daughter waiting. Clock ticking. Every second on this bridge was a second stolen from Bree. A moment that might mean the difference between arriving in time and arriving too late. But his hand was already moving to the brake lever. The Harley slowed, its engine note dropping from a roar to a growl to a rumble as Cade pulled onto the narrow shoulder. Gravel crunched under his tires, and the wind immediately tried to push him back into traffic. He killed the engine and sat for a moment, rain hammering his helmet, watching the girl through his visor. She hadn't moved, hadn't even seemed to notice him. Her knuckles were white where they gripped the railing, and her mouth moved constantly, forming words that the storm swallowed before they could reach his ears. She clutched something small and silver against her chest, a necklace or locket, and every few seconds she would look back over her shoulder as if expecting something terrible to emerge from the darkness. Cade pulled off his helmet and immediately felt the rain soak through his hair and beard. "Miss?" he called out, raising his voice above the wind. "You need help." She turned toward him then, moving like someone in a dream or a nightmare, and what he saw in her eyes made every protective instinct he'd ever possessed flare to life. Terror. Pure, undiluted terror. The kind that carved hollows in a person's face and made their hands shake without mercy. Her lips moved, but the words that came out were barely whispers. They took me and I got away, but they're coming back. They're always coming back." That's when Cade heard them. Engine noise, distant but growing closer. Not the steady drone of highway traffic, but something more aggressive, more purposeful. Multiple vehicles moving fast, too fast for the conditions, weaving between the slower-moving cars with predatory intent. The girl heard them too. Her face went dead white, and she stumbled backward against the railing, the silver locket at her throat catching the light from Cade's headlamp. "Please," she whispered, reaching toward him with a trembling hand. "Please don't let them take me again." In the distance, headlights crested the far end of the bridge. 3 sets, moving in formation, cutting through traffic like sharks through a school of fish. Cade could make out the shapes now. Dark SUVs with tinted windows and no license plates visible from this distance. They moved with coordination, with purpose, and they were closing fast. Time crystallized into a single, perfect moment of choice. Behind him lay 36 miles of flooded roads and his daughter's hospital room, where machines beeped and monitors flashed and a little girl with his eyes waited for her daddy to come home. Ahead of him stood a stranger whose terror was so complete it seemed to radiate from her like heat, whose reaching hand trembled with the kind of desperation that came from staring into an abyss and finding it staring back. Cade looked at that outstretched hand and saw his wife reaching for him from her hospital bed during those final days. Saw Bree's tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb during her first night in the NICU. Saw every moment in his life when someone had needed him to be more than just a man with tattoos and a motorcycle and a checking account that never seemed to have enough zeros at the end. He gunned the engine. "Get on," he growled, extending his hand toward her. "Now." She didn't hesitate. Her fingers found his with desperate strength, and she swung herself onto the bike behind him just as the first SUV's headlights swept across their position. Cade felt her arms wrap around his waist, felt her face press against his back, felt the tremors running through her small frame. "Hold tight," he told her, dropping the Harley into gear. "And whatever happens, don't let go." Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. The bike lurched forward just as the lead SUV's tires screamed against wet asphalt. In his mirrors, Cade could see men in dark clothing leaning out of windows, pointing in their direction, their mouths moving in sharp, urgent commands. But the Harley was already moving, already cutting between lanes of traffic with the fluid grace of a machine built for exactly this kind of chaos. Cade dropped low over the handlebars, feeling the girl, whoever she was, mold herself against his back as they wove through the maze of slower vehicles. Behind them, the SUVs tried to follow, but highway traffic was an unforgiving mistress. What looked like open road to a motorcycle became an impenetrable wall to anything wider than handlebars and hopes. Cade heard horns blaring, brakes squealing, angry voices shouting through rolled-down windows as the pursuit vehicles tried to force their way through gaps that simply didn't exist. The girl's arms tightened around his waist, and he felt her lean closer to his ear. "Exit 12, she said, her voice barely audible above the wind and engine noise. "There's a fire road, off the beaten path." Cade didn't question how she knew about back roads in a part of Texas that most GPS systems forgot to update. He just took the exit, leaning into the turn as the Harley's tires found purchase on rain-slicked asphalt. Behind them, the SUVs were trapped in bridge traffic, but he knew that wouldn't last long. Men with that kind of coordination, that kind of equipment, didn't give up easily. The fire road was barely more than 2 parallel tire tracks cutting through scrub oak and mesquite, but it was exactly what they needed. The Harley's suspension absorbed the worst of the ruts and washouts, and the narrow trail would be impassable to anything larger than a pickup truck. Cade followed the winding path deeper into the woods, branches whipping at their shoulders, mud spraying up from the rear tire. After 20 minutes of riding through terrain that would have challenged a dirt bike, they emerged into a small clearing dominated by the skeletal remains of an old automotive shop. The roof had caved in on one side, and weeds grew through cracks in the concrete floor, but the back wall still stood, and there was enough overhang to get them out of the rain. Cade killed the engine and immediately felt the silence rush in around them, broken only by the steady patter of rain on rusted metal and the distant rumble of thunder. His fuel gauge showed empty now, the warning light glowing like an accusation. They'd burned through their last reserves getting here, which meant they weren't going anywhere until the storm passed and he could figure out where to find gas. The girl slid off the bike slowly, as if her legs weren't quite sure they could support her weight. In the dim light filtering through the broken roof, Cade got his first real look at her. Early 20s, maybe, with delicate features that spoke of good breeding and private schools. Her dress had probably cost more than he made in a month, but now it was ruined, torn and stained with mud and what looked like dried blood around the neckline. She stood hugging herself, shivering in the cool air, and when she looked at him, her eyes held a mixture of gratitude and terror that made his chest ache. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know why you stopped, but thank you." Cade pulled off his leather vest and draped it around her shoulders. It was too big, hanging on her like a tent, but it was dry and warm from his body heat. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated, as if the question required careful consideration. "Alara," she said finally. "My name is Alara." "Cade," he replied, then nodded toward the bike. "We're not going anywhere tonight. Tank's empty, and those boys are probably still out there looking for us." Alara nodded, pulling his vest tighter around herself. "They won't give up," she said quietly. "They can't afford to." Something in her tone made Cade look at her more carefully. This wasn't random violence, wasn't some opportunistic crime. This was professional, organized, expensive. The kind of operation that required resources and planning and the sort of people who didn't take failure well. "Who are you?" he asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Alara was quiet for a long moment, watching rain drip through the broken roof. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Someone who should have been more careful about who she trusted. The old radio in the corner of the workshop crackled to life as Cade fiddled with its antenna, searching for a weather update. Static filled the air, punctuated by fragments of voices and music, until finally a clear signal emerged from the storm of interference. Massive search operation continues for Alara Sterling, daughter of tech billionaire Silas Sterling, who disappeared 3 days ago from her family's compound outside Austin. The FBI has joined local law enforcement in what sources are calling a coordinated kidnapping attempt. Sterling Industries stock has dropped 12% since news of the disappearance broke, with some analysts suggesting. Cade's hand froze on the antenna. He turned slowly to look at Alara, who had gone perfectly still in the corner where she sat wrapped in his leather vest. Her face had drained of what little color it had possessed. "Sterling," Cade repeated quietly. "As in Sterling Industries. As in the man who owns half the tech companies in Texas and most of the data centers between here and California." Alara closed her eyes. "Daddy always said the money would make me a target someday. I just never thought." She trailed off, pulling the vest tighter around her shoulders. The radio continued its relentless broadcast. Reward of $5 million has been posted for information leading to her safe return. Miss Sterling was last seen leaving a charity function in downtown Austin, where sources suggest she may have been lured away by individuals posing as. Cade switched off the radio. The silence that followed felt heavier than the storm outside. $5 million. He'd been riding through the night with a $5 million target on the back of his bike, and he'd had no idea. The scale of what he'd stumbled into hit him like a physical blow. These weren't street thugs or opportunistic criminals. These were professionals, the kind who planned operations months in advance and had resources that made local law enforcement look like playground monitors. "They'll never stop looking," Alara whispered, as if reading his thoughts. "My father's wealth makes me valuable, but it also makes me dangerous to anyone who tries to help me. I'm sorry. I should have told you who I was, but I was so scared, and you were the first person who bothered to stop." Cade knelt beside his motorcycle, checking the fuel line for leaks. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his mind was racing. Bree was still in that hospital bed, still waiting for her father to come home. But now he was harboring the most wanted missing person in Texas, with professional killers closing in and no way to contact the authorities without putting all three of them in danger. "How many of them were there?" he asked, not looking up from the engine. 6 in the original team. Maybe more by now. Alara's voice was steady, but he could hear the fear underneath. "The man leading them, Marcus Voss, he used to work for my father's security company. He knows how we think, how we operate. He's always 3 steps ahead." Thunder rumbled overhead, closer now, and through the broken roof Cade could see lightning painting the clouds in shades of silver and gold. The storm was intensifying, which meant the roads would be getting worse. But it also meant their pursuers would be having trouble too. His phone buzzed against his chest. Another call from the hospital, another message he couldn't answer. Bree's fever, the antibiotics, the blood work that kept coming back wrong. Every minute he spent in this abandoned workshop was a minute stolen from his daughter's bedside, a moment that might matter more than he could possibly know. But when he looked at Alara, huddled in the corner like a broken bird, he knew he couldn't abandon her any more than he could abandon Bree. Some choices weren't really choices at all. They were just tests of who you were when everything else was stripped away. "We need to get you to the police," he said finally. "Somewhere with enough firepower to handle Voss and his team." Alara shook her head. "He has people inside law enforcement. That's how they knew where to find me at the charity function. Someone told them exactly when I'd be vulnerable. Then we go federal. FBI, U.S. Marshals, someone who can." The sound of engines cut through the storm like chainsaws through silk. Distant but growing closer, multiple vehicles moving through the forest with the grinding persistence of predators following a blood trail. Cade was on his feet instantly, moving to the workshop's front window. Through the rain and darkness, he could see headlights weaving between the trees, at least 3 sets, maybe 4. They'd found the fire road, found their trail, found them. "Back exit," he said, grabbing Alara's hand and pulling her toward the rear of the building. But when they reached the door, more lights appeared in the distance. They'd been surrounded, trapped between converging forces with nowhere left to run. The Harley's tank was empty. The radio was dead. And Marcus Voss was closing in with enough firepower to level a small building. Cade pulled Alara back into the shadows near the center of the workshop, where a pile of old engine parts provided some cover. "Stay down," he whispered. "Whatever happens, stay down." The first vehicle crunched to a stop outside, followed by two more. Doors slammed. Voices called out coordinates and positions. "Professional. Organized. Deadly. We know you're in there," a voice called out, smooth and cultured, with just a hint of accent that Cade couldn't place. "Marcus Voss, probably. Mr. Malone, isn't it? Cade Malone of 1247 Pine Street, father of one Brianna Malone, currently hospitalized with acute pneumonia at St. Mary's Medical Center." Cade's blood turned to ice water. They knew about Bree. They'd done their homework, traced his license plate, dug into his life with the efficiency of people who had access to databases that weren't supposed to exist. "Here's what's going to happen," Voss continued. "You're going to send Miss Sterling outside unharmed, and then you're going to walk away. Go back to your daughter. Forget this ever happened. Everyone goes home happy. And if I don't?" Cade called back, surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. "Then your daughter becomes an orphan, and Miss Sterling comes with us anyway. The only difference is how many people die in the process." Alara's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers ice-cold but steady. "Do it," she whispered. "Let them have me. Your daughter needs you more than I do." Cade looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something he recognized. The same quiet courage he'd seen in his wife's eyes during those final weeks, the same stubborn determination to protect the people she loved, even if it meant sacrificing herself in the process. "No," he said quietly. "I've lost enough people. I'm not losing you too." He stood up slowly, hands visible, and walked toward the front of the workshop. Through the broken doorway, he could see Voss silhouetted against the headlights. Tall, lean, expensive suit soaked with rain but still immaculate. Professional to the core.
"Counteroffer," Cade said. "You and me. One-on-one. If you win, you take the girl and I disappear. If I win, you call off your dogs and let us walk." Voss laughed, the sound carrying easily through the storm. "Mr. Malone, I appreciate the melodrama, but this isn't a movie. This is business." "Then let's do business." Cade stepped outside into the rain, feeling the water soak through his shirt instantly. The ground was muddy, treacherous, but he'd fought in worse conditions. Voss's men had formed a loose perimeter around the workshop, but they kept their weapons lowered. Professional courtesy, maybe, or simple confidence that their boss could handle one tired construction worker. Voss stripped off his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing arms corded with lean muscle and marked with the kind of scars that came from years of serious training. Military, probably. Special forces. The kind of man who could kill with his bare hands and sleep soundly afterward. They circled each other in the mud, rain streaming down their faces, while lightning painted the scene in stark black and white. Voss moved like a dancer, all fluid grace and controlled power. Cade moved like what he was, a brawler, a man who'd learned to fight in back alleys and roadhouse parking lots, where style mattered less than the willingness to keep getting up after you'd been knocked down. Voss struck first, a lightning-fast combination that should have ended the fight before it began. But Cade had been in enough bar fights to know that the first exchange was rarely the last one. He absorbed the punishment, let Voss commit to the attack, then drove his elbow into the other man's ribs with all the force he could muster. They went down together, rolling through the mud and broken glass, trading blows that would have hospitalized ordinary men. Voss was faster, more skilled, better trained. But Cade was desperate, and desperation could overcome a lot of technical advantages. The fight lasted 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours. When it ended, Voss was face down in a puddle, unconscious, and Cade was leaning against the workshop wall with blood streaming from a dozen cuts and his left arm hanging at an odd angle. "Call them off," he gasped to Voss's men. "Your boss is done. Contract's over." The mercenaries looked at each other, uncertain. They'd been hired to follow Voss's orders, but Voss wasn't giving any orders anymore. After a long moment, The senior man spoke into his radio, and the other vehicles began to withdraw into the forest. Dawn was breaking by the time Cade and Alara reached the county sheriff's station. Riding double on a borrowed ATV that had maybe half a tank of gas and suspension that had given up trying years ago. The storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world washed clean and gleaming under pale morning sunlight. The parking lot was full of federal vehicles, FBI, U.S. Marshals, Texas Rangers, and at least 3 alphabet agencies Cade didn't recognize. Word had gotten out about Alara Sterling's rescue, and everyone wanted a piece of the action. Cade delivered her to the front steps, where a small army of agents waited to debrief her and begin the long process of dismantling Voss's operation. Alara squeezed his hand once before disappearing into the crowd of suits and badges. Then exhaustion hit him like a falling building. He collapsed on the station's front steps, his injured arm throbbing, his ribs aching from Voss's punishing blows. His phone showed 17 missed calls from St. Mary's Hospital. 17 messages he was afraid to listen to. He'd saved Alara Sterling, but he'd failed his own daughter in the process. Failed to be there when she needed him most. Failed as a father, as a provider, as a man. The sun climbed higher, warming his face but not the cold place in his chest where guilt lived. He should call the hospital. Should find a way to get back to Bree. Should explain to a 7-year-old girl why her daddy had chosen a stranger over his own flesh and blood. Mr. Malone? Cade looked up to see a man in his 60s approaching, flanked by a phalanx of security personnel. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of bearing that came from making billion-dollar decisions before breakfast. Silas Sterling walked like he owned the world, which wasn't far from the truth. "My daughter tells me you saved her life," Sterling said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine emotion. "She tells me you risked everything, including your own child's welfare, to protect a stranger." "Your daughter's safe," Cade replied wearily. "That's what matters." Sterling studied him for a long moment. "She also tells me your daughter is in the hospital. Pneumonia, according to my sources. Experimental treatment that insurance won't cover. Medical bills that would bankrupt most families." Cade's head snapped up. "How do you?" "Mr. Malone, when someone saves my daughter's life, I make it my business to learn everything about them." Sterling's expression softened slightly. "Your daughter is being transferred to Houston Children's Hospital as we speak. The best pediatric pulmonology team in the country. All expenses paid, for as long as treatment takes." "I don't want charity." "It's not charity. It's gratitude." Sterling pulled out a business card and handed it to Cade. "I'm also offering you a job. Head of Personal Security and Crisis Response for Sterling Industries. 7 figures to start, full benefits, housing allowance. All I ask is that you bring the same instincts that saved my daughter to protecting other people's families." Cade stared at the card, not quite believing what he was hearing. "Why?" "Because men who stop for strangers in storms are rare, Mr. Malone. Because the world needs more people who choose compassion over convenience. Because my daughter is alive, because you decided that doing right was more important than doing easy." 6 months later, Cade found himself driving through the same stretch of Texas highway where everything had changed. But instead of a beaten-down Harley with an empty tank, he was behind the wheel of a new Ford pickup, and instead of racing toward uncertainty, he was heading home to a house he owned free and clear in one of Austin's better neighborhoods. Bree was in the passenger seat, healthy and laughing, her pneumonia a fading memory thanks to treatment that would have been impossible without Sterling's intervention. She was telling him about her new school, her new friends, the science project she was working on about storm formation and weather patterns. As they crested the overpass where he'd first seen Alara, Cade slowed the truck and pulled onto the shoulder. The bridge looked different in daylight, without rain and fear and desperate choices. Just concrete and steel, ordinary and unremarkable. "Why are we stopping, Daddy?" Bree asked. Cade looked at the spot where a young woman in a ruined dress had once stood alone while the world rushed past without seeing. "Just remembering something," he said. "Remembering why we stop for people who need help." He put the truck back in gear and drove toward home, no longer a man ignored by the world, but a man who had learned that sometimes the most important journeys began when you chose to stop moving and started paying attention to who might be standing in the storm, waiting for someone to care enough to reach out their hand. In his rearview mirror, the overpass grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, but Cade knew he would never forget the night when everything changed because a stranger trusted him with her life, and he decided to prove worthy of that trust. The road ahead stretched wide and welcoming, full of possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. And for the first time in years, Cade Malone was no longer afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going.